All right, welcome everyone. Today I want to talk about accessibility testing, specifically how to implement accessibility tests against a website where accessibility testing has not been a focus until now. And since the website you're testing may not have been developed with these features in mind, you'll need to constrain the scope so you don't bury the dev team in defects. So rather than losing friends and stressing everyone out, let's construct a minimum accessibility test plan that is agreed upon and known. This is an initial step to a broader goal you should define, like achieving WCAG 2.0 AA compliance. All right, so real quick, some housekeeping. I'm going to go over an example of a minimum accessibility test plan and then automate the accessibility tests for it in Nightwatch.js using an NPM package called Nightwatch-axe-verbose as we continue here. The full article, including source code, can be found in my video description down below, and I'd love it if you'd click that like button as you watch to let me know if you find this useful as we continue. So for the minimum accessibility test plan, first let's try picking an achievable set of requirements that would be most impactful to a user persona with accessibility needs. For our persona today, let's try a set of rules that would be helpful to someone navigating your site using a screen reader due to visual impairment. So here we are on the DeQ University website looking at the list of 90 or so rules in the Axe 4.1 rule set. The rules that I want my minimum accessibility test plan to conform to can sometimes be covered by one, but sometimes more than one rule from this list. And later on in the video, we're going to write test automation that uses these rules to verify a website. So the question becomes, why should we automate our accessibility tests? Well, automating your accessibility tests is important because many accessibility violations are not as obvious as functional defects. For example, many of the accessibility features are not visible in the rendered markup of the page, which is where automation can save you a lot of time. These are going to prevent regression defects from sneaking in later. So in our example minimum accessibility test plan, I want to ensure that all the pages in my site use relevant titles and headings, that all the elements on the page have sufficient color contrast against the background, that the site can be easily navigated by keyboard alone, and in some cases you can verify that with just one rule in Axe, and other times there's more than one rule. So this is an example of one rule of a broader set. I'm just giving you an example here. And finally, I want to make sure that all the images have alt text so that a screen reader can provide someone that's visually impaired context of what an image is showing them. All right, so all the source code is going to be on my GitHub here at github.com/reallymellow under Nightwatch tutorials. In today's lesson, we're going to be working out of the A11Y test plan example directory. So first, let's click on the code button and get the clone URL. Now we'll just take that and clone that into a handy directory and download all the lesson files. All right, so now let's change directory into Nightwatch tutorials. And inside Nightwatch tutorials, let's change into the A11Y directory. And now that we're inside here, let's run npm install to bring in all the packages. All right, so now that that's all brought in, let's open up our IDE. I'm going to use brackets, but VS Code also works pretty good here. So I'm just going to right click and say open brackets project. Okay, so we'll be running our test today against the w3.org's example news site. And here you can see it on my screen here. Looks like your typical news site. So there's a few different ways of running accessibility testing on something like this. So let's start off with the broadest approach first. So let's type in module.exports equals, and we'll name this test run all accessibility assertions because that's what we'll be doing. And then we'll just type function and we'll pass in the browser object. And now we have the shell of our test. So the first thing we need to do is navigate to the news site. So I'm going to leverage the Nightwatch page object model to do that. So we're going to type in browser.page.news.navigate. And that's going to take me to the news site. So now once we're there, we can run our assertions. So to make those assertions available to us, we'll type in axe inject. And then to run them, we just type in axe run. Now axe run is going to take the DOM element that we want to cascade our assertions against. So if we want to run that on all of the elements of the page, we can use the body element here. And then lastly, all we have to do is end our test. So what this should do is call browser.page.news.navigate, navigate to that w3.org news site, inject the Axe framework, run all of the rules against the body element, and then end the test. Okay, so to run our test, we're just going to type in Nightwatch and then -t to specify our test, and then where that test file is located. And this one is the A11yv1.js file. So we'll hit enter. And our browser opens, runs our tests, and then gives us our output. So as I mentioned, we're using the Nightwatch-axe-verbose framework, which gives us this nice output here of all of the violations that Axe found, and it also identifies what passed, how many passed, and what elements are specifically failing what rules, so that you can use these for remediation. So let's take a look at our output a little bit closer. Here's the name of our test, run all accessibility assertions. Here you can see the test that actually passed, right? And the rule names. So aria hidden body, one element was checked against that and passed. Avoid inline spacing, 16 elements were applicable here and passed, and so on, right? So it looks like we have some good color contrast on the site. And if we scroll down a little bit further, let's get into our accessibility violations. Image alt is failing, and it tells you what image is missing the alt text, so the border left top GIF file. And let's see if there's any other types of assertions that are failing on the site. So down a little bit further here, we have some different types of rules that are failing. Here's the Axe rule link name. Links must have discernible text. It calls out this on focus a link here that you could find in the DOM to figure out what that one's doing. And it looks like we also have some failures here due to the region check, and the region specifies that all page content must be contained by landmarks. So what's great about this framework is that if you're not sure what this rule is telling you or how to remediate it, and you want to give this information to your developer and not confuse them, you can go to their GitHub, and it has all the rule names here. And if you just do a Control F and look for region, you can click on that, and then it will take you to the DQ University who maintain this framework and tell you how to fix the problem, as well as what it's actually talking about, right? So region specifically, right, it's saying that you should use these new HTML5 landmark elements to help organize the page. And again, this is one of those things where it's not visible to someone just looking at the page. So it doesn't actually change the user experience visually, right? But for people using assistive technologies like screen readers and things like that, it makes a world of difference because it helps organize it programmatically so that these things can kind of figure out where things are, right? All this is saying is that if you have something like a header, they're surrounded by this header tag. Same thing with navigation, that should all be contained within nav. The main content goes in main and footer and so on. And it tells you that there's different ways of accomplishing this using aria tags if you want. And then it goes into the why it matters, right? So this is actually really useful if you're trying to explain this to a business analyst on why you should fix one accessibility issue versus another. Why would it matter to you? So in this case, navigating a web page is far simpler for screen readers if the content splits between multiple high-level sections. Content outside of sections is difficult to find, and the content's purpose may be unclear. So again, helps with page organization. So this is something new that you can achieve using HTML5 markup. So I would imagine that a lot of legacy sites would actually be failing this rule, which gets me into the next part of my lesson on how to choose what rules to ignore for now and what rules to specifically run against. All right, so let's say we've made a business decision to ignore certain rules for now. How would we exclude those from the same sort of test style that we just ran so that we don't get a bunch of noise and false positives, right? So let's go back to our example before, but let's rename this test to something descriptive for this tutorial, like run everything except contrast and region rules, right? So we have the same exact test structure. We're browsing to the news site, and then we're Axe injecting, and then Axe running against the body. But for this second parameter here, we can include a rules object. And in the rules object, it would contain a collection of the rules that we want to either run or not run. So this is useful if you want to run everything, but exclude a few things, right? So in this case, we pass in color contrast, and for the enabled property, we set that to false. And same thing for region, enabled is false. So if we rerun this test now, it should run the exact same assertions minus color contrast and region. So let's see what happens now. Let's clear out console. Let's run v2. Okay, so we have less assertions failed this time, 44, and 16 passed. And if we look in our list, we should not see anything for region. Yep, here's just our alt text ones from before. And our links must have discernible text, but there are no failing tests for region. So that works great if you're trying to run all the rules and exclude a few. But what if you want to run a few rules and exclude most of the others? Well, that's where another pattern comes into play. So again, the same test as before, but this one will name run only color contrast and alt image. So under Axe run, this time we are going to pass a property that contains an array of rules. So this one is called run only, and you just tell it what you want to run specifically. So it is a comma separated list of strings of the rule names. And if you're trying to figure out what the rule names are, you can get it from this rule descriptions markdown file on the DQ Labs Axe Core GitHub page right here. And so these are the rule IDs it's looking for right here. So let's go back to our command line and clear out our assertions from before. And this time we'll run the v3 file. And we're doing it live. Too many commas. Okay, so we'll clear that out, save that again. And let's run the test one more time. And the failures that we see this time should only be violations of type, color contrast, and image alt. So let's verify that. Sure does look like we have a bunch of images must have alt text errors here. 39 of them, in fact. And is there anything for color contrast? I think this was actually passing color contrast before when I look. Yeah, color contrast is actually pretty good on this site. So 75 elements were checked and they all passed color contrast rules. And everything else that was failing, with the exclusion of 6 elements, were due to missing alt text for the images. So now up to this point, we've established how to run different sets of rules based on our needs in Nightwatch and Nightwatch-axe-verbose. So now how do we put that together to automate our minimum accessibility test plan? So that'll take us to this accessibility test file. So as you saw, there was a tremendous amount of test failures, and just sort of flooding the dev team with that much information isn't always the most effective way of tackling this sort of thing. So that's why this minimum accessibility test plan becomes important. You sort of establish these rules ahead of time on how the site's going to be judged by. It's going to be a smaller, more achievable subset that you can start chipping away at on your path of achieving like full WCAG accessibility, for example. So it's going to make this remediation work a lot more achievable. So now here's an example of how I would approach coding that inside of one of these Nightwatch tests. So here's a more real-world example below. I'm using the before and after hook like you would see in a more mature test suite. In this before hook here, you're doing everything that you want to do when you're setting up the initial test suite. So like you were seeing in the previous example, I just want to navigate to the news and inject the Axe framework so I don't have to do this inside of every single test. It saves a lot of repetitive coding. And then once everything's done, that's when you can call browser end and shut everything down. And as you see here, I'm using descriptive test names, which help you tie it back to what functionality you're trying to cover from that minimum accessibility test plan. So having things like a descriptive title on your web page that's being read aloud to someone that is visually impaired helps them get the context of what the page content should contain. So this first test here is just asserting that the title has something that we define as descriptive that tells us what the intention of the web page is. So here it says, welcome to City Lights, an accessible news page, right? So work with your business analyst to make sure that the title is conveying the information that they think it should. In this case, it's an inaccessible news page. I think we've done our job here, naming it correctly. So that will be our assertion. Let's also assume that when we created our minimum accessibility test plan that we've decided that our main logo should have alt text so that a screen reader knows what the image is of. So to run that assertion only in our test, we're just running only the image alt rule specifically in that test. So by doing it this way, where we are only running this particular image alt rule in this test, you're not lumping a bunch of other assertions in, which makes this test very clear, especially when you combine it with the test name, that if you see a failure here, you know it's only because the main logo does not have alt text if it's failing, but also if it's passing, you know that it does. Another important piece of functionality for screen readers is appropriate use of header tags. And we're going to accomplish that in this test here called news page has accessible headers. And in this case, we're actually using 4 rules, which all do different things around header checks. And 1 is that it should not have an empty heading. 2, the heading order should make sense. 3, that the page has a h1 tag, like a main header. And this last one called p as heading makes sure that you're not using paragraphs as headings. Again, if you wanted to look up any of these particular rules, right, like p as heading, you can just head over to the rule descriptions here and look at what this rule says, right? Ensure p elements are not used as style headings. And it also tells you the severity based on what WCAG University ranks these as. So if you're trying to negotiate priority on some of these defects that you find with your business team, you can say like, well, this is actually a serious one. Maybe we should look at this one before something that's more minor. But let's not get too distracted and get back to the test here. Okay, so here we have all of our rules for that particular test. And since all of these kind of roll up into having accessible headers, I think the name is appropriate and it's okay that we're using more than one check here. And then for our last test here in our minimum accessibility test plan, we've defined that keyboard friendliness on this news page is defined as having a scrollable region focusable, using access keys, using region, using skip link, and having the proper tab index. So again, these all roll into the same sort of classification, being keyboard friendly, so I think it makes sense to run them all together. So let's run this last test and see how it goes. Let's clear out our prior assertions, and we'll run this accessibility test. So now we only have 6 failing assertions and 7 things passing. So now using the results of this test run, you can see how well the site under test is conforming to your minimum accessibility test plan. And if it's not, you have a very concise list of rules of things that you need to remediate. And it very specifically tells you the CSS selectors of the DOM elements that are currently failing their tests, so the developers know what to remediate on the page and where they're located. So I feel like this approach would be more welcomed by the dev team when refactoring an existing website to include more accessibility features. You're starting off with a known and agreed upon minimum standard that your company can add on to over time on its eventual goal of achieving the required and appropriate level of accessibility based on your business requirements or industry standards. So I hope that you'll be able to use this tutorial to get started with automated accessibility testing. I'll be making more testing videos, so subscribe to my channel to be notified of them, and leave me a comment below if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.